Have you ever stopped to wonder what would actually happen if a single, cheap diesel submarine tried to ambush the 80,000-ton pride of the Chinese Navy on its first major deployment and actually pulled it off? The real answer might surprise you more than you'd expect. So let's dig into this together. If you didn't already know, an aircraft carrier isn't just a big boat. It's a floating city of steel, jet fuel, and national pride. We're talking about a $3 billion masterpiece of engineering pushed out into the deep water of the Pacific. On board, there are roughly 3,000 sailors. These are kids in their early 20s. They wake up in cramped metal bunks, walk down narrow gray corridors, and feel the constant, heavy hum of massive engines beneath their boots. They've been told they're untouchable. They're sailing on the apex predator of the ocean. Steel doesn't bleed. To understand why this ship matters so much, we have to look at how ocean control actually works. For decades, the deep water belonged entirely to the United States and its allies. They could park a group of warships off any coast on Earth and control the sky for hundreds of miles in every direction. Building your own carrier isn't just about matching that firepower. It's a massive, floating announcement. It tells the world you can pack up a military base, sail it right up to someone else's front door, and stay there. You cast a shadow so large that nobody even thinks about fighting back. The core assumption was always that once you build the ultimate weapon, your smaller enemies will simply stay out of your way. But carriers never travel alone. They're the center of a heavily armed circle of protection. Around this massive flat deck, you have destroyers scanning the sky with radars that can spot a target miles away. You have frigates dragging long cables through the water, listening for the faint hum of enemy propellers. You have supply ships carrying millions of gallons of fuel. It's an intricate, perfectly timed dance of radar waves, sonar pings, and overlapping defensive ranges. The math says absolutely nothing gets through. You could fire a dozen missiles at this group, and the computers would calculate the intercepts before the sailors even knew they were under attack. Imagine being a 19-year-old mechanic working on the bottom deck of that carrier. You're separated from the freezing, crushing black pressure of the Pacific by just a few inches of hardened hull. You trust that metal. You trust the destroyer circling miles away. You trust the screens. But beneath you, the water drops down for 2 miles. It's completely pitch black. The pressure down there can crush a thick steel drum like an empty soda can. And water is heavy. It crushes sound. It bends light. It hides things entirely. The sea keeps its own secrets. Temperature changes in the water column can literally bounce sonar waves right back at a ship. This creates invisible blind spots the size of mountains beneath the surface. You can have the most expensive listening equipment in the world, but if a tiny, silent object is sitting perfectly still in a cold pocket of water just 200 feet down, your screen shows absolutely nothing. The commanders standing on the bridge are looking out at a flat, calm sea. They watch their fighter jets launch off the deck, smelling the thick exhaust, feeling the vibration in their teeth. They assume the only threat that could kill their massive ship is another multi-billion-dollar weapon. They don't know the math is already broken. Imagine what sits inside that blind spot. It isn't a massive, nuclear-powered submarine. Nuclear subs are fast, but their cooling pumps always make a little bit of noise. Instead, it's a tiny, cramped diesel sub. And right now, its diesel engines are off. It's running entirely on batteries. For the crew inside, the air is stale and heavy with the smell of sweat and machine oil. They are barely breathing, hovering perfectly still in the dark, waiting for the massive shadow of the carrier to pass directly overhead. They don't need to chase the fleet, they just need to wait for the fleet to sail into the trap. When the submarine commander finally pulls the trigger, he doesn't fire a swarm of missiles. He fires just 1 or 2 heavyweight torpedoes. But here is the thing about modern torpedoes that most people completely misunderstand. They don't actually hit the side of the ship. Punching a hole in the side of a carrier is annoying, but it won't sink it. These ships are built with dozens of watertight compartments exactly for that reason. Instead, a modern torpedo dives deep, swims directly under the very center of the ship, and detonates in the water right beneath the hull. This creates a massive bubble of rapidly expanding gas. For a fraction of a second, the water supporting the middle of the carrier simply vanishes. 80,000 tons of steel, jets, and humans are suddenly suspended in midair, supported by nothing but an empty void of gas. Gravity takes over immediately. The front and the back of the ship suddenly weigh too much. The entire ship bends violently downward into the bubble. And then, a split second later, the water rushes back in with the force of a geyser, violently smashing into the bottom of the ship, snapping its metal spine. Inside the carrier, that 19-year-old mechanic doesn't hear an explosion. He feels a shockwave traveling through the dense water at over 3,000 miles an hour. It hits the hull like a physical hammer. The deck beneath his boots violently heaves upward, throwing everyone and everything to the steel ceiling. Massive generators tear free from their heavy bolts. Thousands of miles of electrical cables snap like dry twigs. The steady, comforting hum of the engines instantly dies, replaced by a terrifying, grinding screech of tearing metal. The lights go completely black. Emergency red lights flicker on a few seconds later, casting long, unnatural shadows down the tilted hallways. But it's the sound that tells them the ship is dead. It's the sound of the ocean, under immense pressure, forcing its way through the cracked steel hull. Water doesn't just leak in. At that depth, it cuts like a blade. It blasts through steel walls, instantly flooding the lower engine rooms with freezing, jet-black seawater. The heavy, watertight doors automatically slam shut, trapping whoever is left on the wrong side in the dark. Up on the surface, the defensive ring of destroyers and frigates goes into absolute chaos. Their radar screens are completely clear, their anti-aircraft missiles are fully armed and ready to launch. The commanders are screaming for a target, but there is no target in the sky. The most advanced, expensive air defense network on the planet is completely useless because the attack came from underneath and the weapon is already gone. You can't shoot down gravity. You can't fire a surface-to-air missile at a cracked spine. The missiles had nothing to shoot. In less than 5 minutes, the pride of the fleet has gone from an untouchable floating fortress to a completely paralyzed, sinking piece of metal. The flight deck aggressively tilts. Multi-million-dollar fighter jets begin sliding off the edge, crashing into the waves below. The rules of engagement just shattered. Billions of dollars in firepower, decades of technological development, and the unquestioned assumption of deep-water invincibility have just been completely erased by a cheap battery-powered tube and the cold, hard physics of saltwater. Down in the water, there is no heroic music playing. There is just the blinding, chaotic reality of 3,000 human beings thrust into an environment they were never designed to survive. When a ship that massive goes down, it doesn't leave quietly. It creates a violent, swirling suction effect that drags everything on the surface down into the black water. The sailors who managed to jump before the flight deck slipped under are now fighting for their lives in pitch darkness. They are wearing heavy, fire-retardant uniforms and steel-toed boots that suddenly weigh 50 pounds when soaked in seawater. The ocean surface isn't just cold. It's covered in a thick, choking layer of highly toxic aviation fuel and hydraulic fluid that burns their eyes and fills their lungs every time they try to gasp for air. Every time you buy a cheap piece of plastic shipped across the ocean, you are relying on the exact same illusion of safety that just failed these sailors. For the crews on the surrounding destroyers, the nightmare is entirely different. They can hear the screams of their friends floating across the water. They can see the tiny, blinking strobe lights on the emergency vests bobbing in the dark. Their most basic human instinct and centuries of naval tradition demands that they stop their ships, drop their rescue boats, and pull those kids out of the freezing water. But their commanders know they are still inside the kill zone. The submarine that just broke their flagship in half is still down there somewhere, silently listening. If a destroyer stops its engines to rescue survivors, it becomes a stationary target. It becomes the next victim. So the captains have to make a choice that will haunt them for the rest of their lives. They have to order their helmsmen to keep the engines running, push the throttle forward, and actively steer away from the floating survivors to maintain their defensive maneuvers. Survival meant sailing away. 2,000 miles away, in a heavily fortified, brightly lit command center in Beijing, the air is thick with a completely different kind of panic. Men in perfectly pressed uniforms are staring at massive digital maps covering the walls. 10 minutes ago, their flagship was a glowing green icon representing the absolute peak of their national power. It was the physical proof that they finally owned the deep water. Now, that icon is simply gone. The encrypted data links are entirely dead. The Supreme Commander walks into the room, demanding to know who fired the weapon. He expects coordinates. He expects a target to destroy. But the radar operators, the people trained to monitor every single frequency on the planet, have to look at him and tell him they have absolutely no idea. The ocean swallowed the evidence. Was it an American attack submarine? Was it a smaller, desperate regional navy? Was it a rogue faction? The torpedo didn't leave a return address. This is the impossible decision that training manuals don't cover. The commander is staring at a clock that is rapidly running out. Within an hour, commercial satellites are going to pass over that exact patch of the Pacific. Pictures of a massive, burning oil slick and thousands of drowning Chinese sailors are going to hit the global internet. The regime has built its entire modern identity on projecting unstoppable strength. If Beijing blames the United States and launches a retaliatory strike against American bases, they risk starting a nuclear war based on a complete guess. But if they do nothing, if they stand in front of their citizens and admit that their $3 billion pride and joy was effortlessly deleted by an invisible enemy they can't even identify, their political legitimacy instantly shatters. They are trapped between starting a global conflict and committing political suicide. All the hypersonic missiles, all the standing armies, and all the money in the world cannot solve the problems sitting on that screen. The room is dead silent, except for the steady, cold hum of the computers. Within hours, the encrypted flash message hits the desk of an American admiral standing on the bridge of a completely different aircraft carrier, maybe 2,000 miles away in the Philippine Sea. He reads the short, jagged lines of text. A Chinese carrier is gone. Sunk. The admiral looks down at the thick steel deck beneath his boots, feeling the steady vibration of his own massive nuclear reactors. For his entire career, that vibration meant absolute safety. Now, it feels like a giant, pulsing target painted on his back. He looks out at his own ring of destroyers circling on the horizon. They are running the exact same radar software, using the exact same sonar physics, and relying on the exact same mathematical assumptions that just got 3,000 Chinese sailors killed. If a cheap battery-powered tube can slip through their net, the American net is just as fragile. That is the moment the global military machine completely freezes. You have to understand how navies actually make decisions. They don't just sail around hoping for the best. They operate strictly on calculated risk. If the computers say you have a 99% chance of stopping an incoming threat, you sail your billion-dollar ship into the zone. But when a brand new flagship vanishes without a single warning alarm, the math completely breaks. You suddenly have an invisible variable. No commander on Earth is going to risk an 80,000-ton floating city when they don't even know what the new rules are. Orders begin flashing out from naval headquarters in Washington, London, and Tokyo. The commands are frantic and entirely unprecedented. Every major aircraft carrier, every massive assault ship, every multi-billion-dollar piece of deep-water pride is ordered to immediately alter course. They are told to leave the deep trenches of the Pacific and sprint for the safety of shallow coastal waters. In shallow water, a submarine has nowhere to dive. It can't hide in the deep, cold thermal layers. But by running for the coast, the greatest navies of the world are admitting something incredibly uncomfortable. They are admitting they can no longer survive in the open ocean. The deep water was no longer a sanctuary. Think about the 19-year-old sonar operator sitting in the dark combat information center of an American destroyer right now. Yesterday, his job was a routine bore. He stared at a green waterfall of data on a screen, looking for the loud, obvious mechanical signatures of big nuclear subs. Today, he is sweating completely through his uniform. He knows he is looking for a ghost. He knows that if a tiny, silent diesel sub is just sitting on battery power, in the water ahead of them, he won't see it on his screen until the torpedo is already running. The physical equipment he spent years learning to use simply cannot do the job he needs it to do right now. His headphones are filled with the ambient static of the ocean, and every single crackle of biological noise sounds like a steel hull breaking. This isn't just a tactical retreat. It is the sudden, violent collapse of a century of military thinking. For 100 years, the core belief of every major power was that whoever builds the biggest, heaviest, most heavily armed ship controls the world. Entire defense budgets were built around forging these massive steel islands. Entire foreign policies relied on parking them off the coast of a hostile nation to force them to behave. But in the span of a single afternoon, the aircraft carrier has transformed from the ultimate weapon of intimidation into an unacceptable liability. If you deploy it, it might get quietly deleted by a $20 million metal tube. If it sinks, you lose thousands of kids and your national prestige goes down with them. So, the only logical choice is to keep it safely tied to a dock. The open oceans are suddenly entirely empty of the massive gray ships that used to police them. The big kids have all run off the playground, and that sudden absence of power leaves a massive, terrifying vacuum right where the modern world actually functions. Think about what actually moves across that empty ocean. Right now, there is a 50-year-old civilian captain standing on the bridge of a massive cargo ship in the middle of the South China Sea. Beneath his boots are 20,000 steel shipping containers. They hold everything from hospital antibiotics to the lithium batteries in your phone. For his entire career, he has sailed through these waters with a quiet sense of security. He knew that if a pirate or a hostile nation tried to stop his ship, a gray-hulled destroyer from one of the major powers was always just a radio call away. The navies of the world were the invisible police force keeping the trade routes open. But today, he looks at his long-range radar screen, and the deep water is entirely empty. The police have abandoned the neighborhood. If an 80,000-ton flagship, bristling with the most advanced acoustic sensors and defensive interceptors ever built, can be quietly snapped in half without firing a single shot, what hope does a slow, clumsy, completely unarmed container ship have? A commercial hull isn't heavily armored. It is just thin, cheap steel designed to maximize cargo space. A single heavyweight torpedo wouldn't just break it. It would completely vaporize the middle of the ship. The captain knows this. His crew knows this. But more importantly, the people who fund his voyage know this. Thousands of miles away in a quiet, temperature-controlled boardroom in London, a group of insurance executives is watching the exact same satellite imagery of the sinking carrier. This is where the military failure bleeds directly into your daily life. You might not realize it, but maritime insurance is the actual engine of the global economy. A cargo ship is not legally allowed to enter a major port without a massive insurance policy covering the ship, the cargo, and the environmental damage if it sinks. For 70 years, those insurance premiums were incredibly cheap. The actuaries based their math on the unquestioned assumption that the oceans were completely safe. The American and Allied navies essentially subsidized global trade by promising to protect everyone for free. That promise just evaporated. The actuaries are staring at a completely broken risk model. They don't know who fired the torpedo. They don't know if the ocean is full of cheap, battery-powered hunter-killer submarines waiting for targets. If the most powerful warships on Earth are hiding in shallow water, absolutely nothing is protecting the trillion-dollar arteries of global commerce. So the executives do the only mathematical thing they can do. They don't just raise the premiums. They pull the coverage entirely. Within hours of the carrier sinking, emergency notifications flash to thousands of commercial ships across the Pacific. The policies are suspended indefinitely. The ships are no longer legally insured. The ocean was suddenly closed. Out on the water, the civilian captain gets the message. He has no choice. If he keeps sailing toward Los Angeles or Seattle, the port authorities will physically block his ship from entering the harbor. So he reaches over and pulls back the heavy brass throttle. The massive diesel engines deep in the belly of the ship spool down into silence. He orders the crew to drop anchor in the shallow waters near the Philippines, or if they are in the deep ocean, to simply drift. All across the Pacific, thousands of massive steel islands packed with the lifeblood of the modern world just stop moving. This is an entirely new kind of hostage situation. Nobody hijacked a ship. Nobody blockaded a port. but the supply chain that keeps your city functioning has been completely paralyzed by fear alone. The political leaders in Washington and Beijing are screaming at their admirals to fix the problem, to get their fleets back out there and secure the shipping lanes. But the admirals have to look their presidents in the eye and admit the bitter truth. They can't. If they send their remaining carriers out to guard the cargo ships, they are just offering up more $3 billion targets to an enemy they still cannot see. The military machine is completely trapped by its own vulnerability. Let's put you right in the middle of this. It takes exactly 3 days for the frozen ocean to reach your neighborhood. Modern cities do not have massive warehouses full of backup supplies anymore. We built our entire society on something called just-in-time delivery. It relies on a perfect, unbroken chain of massive steel ships moving across the Pacific 24 hours a day. When that chain stops, the shelves empty faster than you can imagine. You walk into your local pharmacy to get basic blood pressure medication, and the pharmacist just shakes her head. The active ingredients for those pills are sitting in a steel box, baking in the sun on a stationary ship off the coast of Manila. The factory in your town that makes car parts sends 3,000 workers home because the computer chips they need are stranded in the exact same way. The politicians immediately look for a historical solution. They look back at the 1940s and demand that the admirals form convoys. The idea is to group 50 civilian cargo ships together and surround them with heavily armed warships to blast a safe path across the water. But the admirals have to explain why that simply will not work anymore. In the old days, submarines had to physically look through a periscope. They had to get close to the surface and close to the target. Today, a battery-powered drone submarine can sit silently in the deep, cold layers and launch an autonomous weapon from 30 miles away. If you group 50 giant ships together now, you aren't creating a protected convoy. You are just creating a massive, unmissable shadow. There was no safety in numbers. The actual military balance of the planet has entirely flipped, and nobody in power wants to admit it out loud. For a century, the advantage always went to the country with the biggest factories, the heaviest steel, and the most expensive ships. But that era just died at the bottom of the Pacific. The advantage now belongs entirely to whoever is hiding. It costs $3 billion and takes 10 years to build an aircraft carrier. It costs maybe $10 million and takes a few weeks to build a silent, unmanned metal tube that can crack that carrier in half. The financial math of war is completely broken. You cannot survive a conflict where the enemy spends the equivalent of a large house to completely destroy your floating city. This is the exact nightmare that paralyzes the American admirals looking at their own multi-billion-dollar fleets. They suddenly realize they are holding a handful of wildly expensive liabilities every time they push. A massive ship out into the deep water, they risk a national catastrophe that they cannot defend against. So they stop deploying them. They keep them safely tucked close to home, guarding their own shallow coastal waters. And because the big ships stay home, the deep water, the massive, ungoverned space between the continents, becomes a total no man's land. Without a superpower navy willing to risk its pristine ships to act as the global police force, the ocean immediately fractures. Smaller regional powers realize they can do whatever they want. A country with 50 cheap diesel submarines can essentially blockade an entire continent, and there is no global authority that can push them back without risking a massive, humiliating loss. The entire concept of free global trade was essentially a bluff, held together by the terrifying shadow of those massive aircraft carriers. And a single, unseen torpedo just called the bluff. So the real question isn't how long it takes to build a better defense against a modern submarine. The real question is how a tightly connected, globalized world is supposed to function when the deep oceans belong to absolutely no one. And that question has a much more uncomfortable answer. The uncomfortable answer is that we have to relearn how to live entirely alone on our own continents. If the deep water is permanently a no man's land, nations have to start manufacturing absolutely everything they need right inside their own borders. That sounds like a simple, common-sense political talking point, but the physical reality of actually doing it is an absolute nightmare. It means tearing up the entire foundation of the 21st century. You can't just build a massive microchip factory overnight. You can't magically summon rare minerals from the dirt of your own backyard if they only physically exist in the mountains on the other side of the planet. The heavily optimized, interconnected web of human survival completely snaps the moment those big steel cargo ships stop moving. And the most powerful navies on Earth cannot fix it. The admirals standing in their perfectly climate-controlled war rooms finally have to admit that the fundamental physics of the ocean have permanently turned against them. For hundreds of years, water was just a flat surface to sail across. If you had the heaviest guns and the thickest steel armor, you owned the surface. But water isn't flat, it is three-dimensional. It is incredibly heavy and dense. It crushes high-frequency radar waves. It bends and distorts sonar pings. The ocean naturally hides small, cheap, disposable hunters perfectly, while simultaneously painting a massive acoustic bullseye on anything large enough to actually project power. The very environment the great navies thought they had mastered was actually just waiting for the right kind of invisible spark to burn their entire doctrine to the ground. The politicians keep slamming their fists on heavy wooden tables, demanding a technological miracle. They want a new kind of deep penetrating sonar or a new kind of defensive torpedo interceptor. They want something, absolutely anything, that will let them put their massive aircraft carriers back out onto the board. They desperately want the old rules back, but the naval engineers just stare at the floor. You cannot simply engineer your way out of gravity and deep water pressure. If an enemy can build 10,000 silent, battery-powered underwater drones for the exact same price you pay to build just one massive flagship, the financial math is completely insurmountable. You will always run out of multi-billion-dollar ships long before they ever run out of $20 million traps. The math had finally caught up to the metal. Think about the ocean right now. It is vast, deep, freezing cold, and completely indifferent to human ambition. The cracked steel wreckage of the Chinese aircraft carrier is already settling into the thick, dark silt at the bottom of the Pacific Trench. The heavily pressurized saltwater is already quietly eating away at the billions of dollars of advanced radar arrays and the twisted, crushed husks of fighter jets. And 3 miles straight up above that wreckage, the surface of the water is perfectly calm. There are no massive gray warships aggressively cutting through the waves. There are no slow, heavy container ships carrying the lifeblood of the global economy. There is just an empty, terrifying expanse of deep blue water that absolutely nobody owns anymore. The great era of the Blue Water Empire didn't end in a massive, sky-burning exchange of nuclear fire. It ended quietly, in the freezing dark, because someone finally figured out how to use the ocean itself against the heavily armored ships that thought they had conquered it. The most expensive shadow on Earth was erased by something that cast no shadow at all. This has been a completely fictional scenario based on military theory, deep-water physics, and historical naval doctrine. No actual aircraft carriers were harmed in the making of this script.